Hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about evolution, the history of natural selection. I chose a recent news article regarding the unknown lizard where some scientists ran an experiment, and I will go over this experiment with you. The hypothesis of this experiment was that different behaviors may be favored by natural selection in different environments. The experiment consisted of anole lizards being categorized on a spectrum from very bold to very shy. The lizards were released onto 8 Bahamian islands. On 4 of the islands, the lizards did not have to worry about predators when attempting to get food when on the ground, but on the other 4 islands, there were predators. The point of the experiment was that on the island with no predators, they expected to see lizards with more bold risk-taking behaviors to survive and reproduce, and they would see that these bold risk-taking behaviors would be passed on to their offspring. But then on the island with predators, they expected the bold lizards to be more vulnerable to predation and not being able to pass on these behaviors to the offspring. The results so far, the scientists observed that on the island with predators, the bold lizards were more vulnerable to predation as they expected. There is no set conclusion whether or not behavior is susceptible to natural selection, as the scientists are still gathering the data of the offspring. Now that we have learned a little bit about the possibility of risk-taking behaviors being favored by natural selection, let's take a dive into the history of natural selection itself. And starting from the beginning, we have Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin embarked on a journey in 1831 aboard the HMS Beagle. Before Darwin left for his journey, he still believed in the biblical creation of life forms. The goal of this trip was to survey the coastline of South America and make note of the harbors to create a better map of the region. On this 5-year journey, Darwin only spent 18 months at sea, and during the rest of his time, he was on land collecting rocks, plants, animals, and fossils. It was on this 5-year journey that he discovered that great theory of natural selection. And this is when we get into Darwin's finches, which are very well known today. While Darwin was on his voyage around the world, he noticed many finches on the Galapagos Islands. The strange thing about these finches were the many different beak shapes and sizes. Darwin noticed that the finches he observed on the islands were similar to ones he had observed on the mainland. Darwin hypothesized that the many island species he saw may be a modified version of the original mainland species. He then called this modification of the finches natural selection. Darwin argued that natural selection was the outcome of 3 principles that happened in nature. Characteristics of organisms are inherited or passed from parents to offspring. More offspring are produced than can survive. This means there are not enough resources for survival and reproduction. And lastly, offspring differ among each other, meaning their characteristics. And these variations of characteristics are inherited. Darwin then argued that offspring with more favorable characteristics, such as ones that would allow the offspring to compete best for resources, would survive and pass those variations of characteristics onto their offspring. So since these traits are inherited, they will be better represented in the next generation, and this will lead to change in populations in a process called descent with modification, as Darwin called it, or otherwise known as evolution. He thought of natural selection as survival of the fittest. Now, when Charles Darwin mentioned survival of the fittest in regard to natural selection, most people back then thought it meant that only the strongest, bravest, and the best would survive. This is not true. What Darwin meant by fittest was those with the combination of traits that would allow the organism to survive and reproduce more offspring to pass on their traits. Being fit depended on the environment around the organism and the combination of traits needed to survive in that environment. These traits could make the organism small, weak, etc. It's whatever was needed to survive the environment. Darwin then theorized that natural selection could lead to speciation. Speciation is when one species gives rise to another, and this is one of the processes that causes evolution. This process also helps explain the diverse Earth we live on today. The acceptance of natural selection. Charles Darwin released his On the Origin of Species book nearly 20 years after his findings. This book discussed the theory of evolution through natural selection. Darwin did not tell anyone of his ideas or release his book until 1859. It wasn't until after Alfred Russel Wallace released similar beliefs in 1858 that Darwin decided to publish his book. This book set off a worldwide controversy, just as Darwin had expected. Darwinian thinking contradicted religious beliefs, which is one of the major reasons his theory of evolution through natural selection was not widely accepted. And there are my citations. Thank you.